Hello everybody, just doing a bit of show and tell about the articulated knees that I made for this class. I've got the finished articles just here, and this is the inside of it. This is the fan side. You can see how the articulations move nicely from straight to see slightly more than you need for movement in armoured combat. The things that are missing off this at the minute is obviously any strapping or attachment points, which we'll get to eventually. So normally to hold these on, I drill a hole in here and in here, and then have a simple strap that goes around the back of the knee. And then, assuming this is the left knee, I would drill a series of 5 holes. And I normally use an odd number of holes because then it doesn't look so bad if you've drilled one slightly off. Whereas if you've got 4 or 6, it seems to be more easy to tell when there's slight holes in it. And then these, and this is probably one of the most difficult bits about the whole armouring process, is actually fitting the knees or whatever you're making to the people. And it takes probably more time with the fitting than it actually does to construct the things in the first place. And what I would do to articulate these, to actually attach these to a coist, is I have my coist plate that actually finishes on a matching line there, and I would put a strip of leather that covers both on the inside. I have experimented with putting the coisters on the inside of these before, but particularly if you're using things like leather or plastic, they're quite thick, and what that does is that takes up a big chunk of space, and you end up with your whole knee joint being chunkier than it needs to be. And one of the things you really can see with a lot of SCA armour, particularly stuff that's been made by amateurs, is it's a lot clunkier than the medieval originals that were made by the masters. Now, some of that is through the materials we use, because we buy steel in sheets rather than having a platener hammer out a sheet exactly how thick we want it, or even with a gradation in the thickness how we want it and in the right shape that we can then form into our knees. So we're kind of stuck. These are all 16 gauge, so 1.5mm thick steel. Whereas, you know, maybe in the originals would have been actually here is 2mm thick steel, because that's the bit that it hits if you're a cavalryman on a horse and you're fighting with a cavalryman and you've got this on and your knees are clashing. Whereas the bits around the side, particularly on the inside, don't need to be that thick. They can be lighter and thinner. All of these things add up. The actual weight and the clunkiness add up to restricting your fighting ability. Now, this is a thing that we see and probably have not really understood before, particularly in my group, is actually how disheartening it can be when you feel you just can't move. Okay, and most of us now, even people like me who are fairly large and strong and fit, I'm not that fit once I've got 20 kilos of armour strapped to me. And if you're new and you've got 20 kilos of armour strapped to you, it feels like an impossible task to swing a sword. So a lot of my work and my focus now is actually making things sleeker, lighter, and being able to achieve nicer custom fits for smaller people or people who are not so fit, and actually being able to say, listen to people and get that feedback, and understand that when people are complaining that in fighting that they can't do anything, or that they feel like they can't do anything, it comes quite often from their equipment. I mean, the other thing that is normally from their footwork, but you know, if somebody's telling you, well, no, I just can't do this, I mean, then you have to look at their gambeson sleeve, saying, well, actually, have they got a belted gambeson which is rigid and it won't let them lift their arms from here? Or are they carrying like an extra few kilos of steel on their arm that they just don't need to? But then they're just not physically strong enough to do this more than once. That's like a whole part of my research, which is, you know, when people ask me, like, how do you do armouring? Like, what I say is, well, you get a sheet of metal and you hit it with a hammer until it's the right shape you want. but the real art to it is understanding that shape and understanding that shape you're going for. And the tools are just a means to achieve that shape. So what I've spent more money on over the last 18 years is books, books with pictures of armour in. And I've got some beautiful picture books with sort of like table-sized picture books which are showing me like what those shapes are. Because once you can see the shape, then everything becomes much easier, because then you know what you're looking for. And like early days, I'd be there hammering and hammering and hammering away on a piece to try and make like what I would now consider a very simple shape, because I didn't really have in my mind that picture of that finished shape. Whereas if you see on the videos I created for this process, it didn't take me very long to do the dishing at all. You know, like it's just a few minutes work with the hammer, and then that's much easier, and you can produce more and you can produce better stuff. Like, but it's understanding that shape, actually studying that shape. And I often have to restrain myself when I'm looking at, say, the SCA unofficial armour construction site, where people are posting up things that they've made with like genuinely well-intentioned, but with it to create something that protects themselves in armoured combat, which is great, but it does look terrible, and it does look like you're an extra from a Mad Max film. Whereas if you put the same amount of effort in, you can create something that is correct for period. You can make it look nice, and it will be better fitting, better articulating, and better enabling for you as a fighter. What I saw recently was somebody created these big chunks of aluminium pauldrons, which stuck out quite a long way because they're like 3mm thick aluminium with padding underneath them. But of course, once you've put a helmet on and a gorget, like once you lift that up, then that's going to start to interfere with what you're doing, particularly if you're moving around like energetically, as we tend to do in armoured combat. So to summarize that little section, study the shapes you're aiming for and don't be scared to fail. So got a good example just here, actually. This is a bassinet I'm working on, and the shape just isn't quite right. Okay, now it looks like a decent helmet, it actually work as a decent helmet, but it wasn't what I was aiming for. And fundamentally, it's slightly too pointy, which is why I extended the top to make it more of an onion top. So this is not a wasted project, but I mean, it could have easily been, and I'd have just scrapped it and started again. Whereas if I compare it to like my bassinet, which is a bit heavier because it's got an aventail on it, you can see the difference in those profiles. And they're made from like virtually identical patterns. Now this one's narrower and pointier, and sadly it doesn't quite fit me, but it's a great learning experience, and it'll be a good for somebody who's got a slightly smaller head than me. So my scrap bin is normally filled, particularly when I'm trying to make a new shape I haven't tried before, filled with the test pieces and the test pattern, because when you're forming the metal, it deforms, plastically deforms. So you're not just curving, but you're stretching and shaping. And this is the kind of thing you've got to take account of as well. But you're not really stretching and shaping that much if you're making like simple shapes like in here, but it does move slightly. So what you may find is you end up doing trimming and cutting of the patterns and working out on the bench grinder to get the curves right. And something I spent quite a long time learning was actually how shallow a curve that was really required on these two parts here that have been welded together. Because if you make it slightly too much, you end up with very, very pointy knees, like the ones I currently wear, because I made it like a decade and a half ago. And you end up using more metal, which is again heavier, clunkier, takes up more space, and doesn't move so nicely. Next bit about tools. So people get very romantic and sentimental about tools, particularly older tools. Now, to me, I don't really ascribe to this view. You know, if I have a tool in a workshop that needs to be modified for me to achieve a goal, then the tool is going to get modified. Like for example, I've got lots of these stakes which I've picked up over the years, and these are tinsmith stakes that which pick up off eBay, normally for £20 a piece, whatever. If they're really expensive, I wouldn't bother buying them, and quite often you end up buying a job lot because you want one particular stake. So this shape here, I don't think I've ever used in armouring. So I picked these ones looking a bit rusty. But one day, if I start making globose breastplates, for instance, this with its slightly curved top is going to come in really handy. And then when that happens, that sharp edge there is going to get ground off, because that sharp edge will mess up the edge of my my breastplate, for example. Something I made, well, one of the most basic things to make is a dishing hammer. This hammer here does not make good shapes in steel. It deforms it too much and stretches and thins it too much in certain places. It means that you've got to put in a bucket load of work cleaning it up. Again, with the whole non-sacred tools, this is a simple £3 blacksmith's crosspeen hammer that's had a 3-inch dish carved at the end of it with an angle grinder. Now this is the thing that makes, or helps to make, most of the bits that come out of my workshop. Leaving again, the back is been smoothed off and slightly polished for helping with raising type activities. There's another one I made. This is just a brick chipping hammer, and basically all I've done is slightly rounded the ends off them and polished it, and then same with the back end, and that was just to help me get into places you couldn't get to with a ball peen or another hammer. So the one thing you can do with these is, because these are cheap and are really readily available, they're a great source of raw materials if you need to shape a hammer. But if you want a hammer that's got a slightly narrower face, just take one of these and grind it down. Most people now don't have access to a forge, and actually having the forge and the forging skills is a fairly large investment in time. You can get an angle grinder for like £15–20 from B&Q, a local DIY shop, and use that as an alternative. I mean, if you want to get more involved and more advanced, I have here like a bit of inch square steel bar stock that one day is going to get turned into some hammers. This will be forged and pierced. But my actual main driver for getting this bit of stock, I wanted something that could get inside helmet to do riveting. And then a few months later, I picked up one of these off eBay, which is a blacksmith's leafing hammer, which allows me to get pretty much into everywhere I want. So that's why this project's a bit on hold. So there are a few things that I've picked up which have genuinely made life much easier and quicker. And first one is a number 5 Roper Whitney punch, and these are available in cheap knockoff, or you can buy the originals. Doesn't really matter for what we do, but actually we've just been able to set the depth on the depth gauge and quickly punch holes. Save me a bucket load of time on a bucket load of projects. This is actually the actual hole size punching is adjustable, and it comes with a set of dies in it. Ball stake. This is probably the thing that gets the most hammering. You see how shiny the top is there. That's gets used on every single project, and it was such a big jump in my armouring skill potential when I got this. This is the only thing I've actually bought new, I think, for armouring. It was, everything else has been bought secondhand off eBay, or or just normal modified DIY type tools. Another thing that sometimes comes in really useful is an offset mushroom stake. Now this only maybe gets used 5% of the time, but having that smooth mushroom surface that you can actually then fit inside a shape and then hammer directly on sometimes comes in very useful. So if you see one cheap, I would pick it up. And then you get proper dishing hammers like this. They're well worth the money. But he's interesting because it's only slightly heavier than my normal hammer, but I find I get tired really quickly when using this. So definitely this one is the optimum weight for me. And I use this one if I need to get further inside something because it's longer head, or if it's really hard work. I want to give it a few extra smacks. A lot of the work is done with very small hammers indeed. You can see this one here is about the length of my finger. It's got one flat face, one rounded face. If you're trying to do things like tidy up the edges of the fans, like something like this, which you can precisely control, is an extremely useful tool. The thing that came with my my ball stake was the stake holder, which I just got stuck into a tree stump. Now, again, there's nothing magical or sacred about me sticking in a tree stump. If you want to go to the local DIY shop and get some timber and bolt it together and stick one of these on the top, that works just as well. And the same goes for the dishing stump. This was carved out of a lump of tree because somebody gave me a lump of tree. Any lump of wood will do the same job. Or people use the bottom of gas bottles that have been shaped. People use round steel bar that's been put into a donut to give you like an infinite depth. And this one here is particularly set up for the things I do, which is producing armor for my local friends and for beginners, which is just like a deeper dish, slightly shallower dish, and a polishing dish. And the deeper dish kind of helps with things like doing basket hilts, where the curve is quite pronounced, particularly on this top edge here, whereas the shallow dish does for all these kind of joints, which don't really require that much depth. And again, that's just carved in with an angle grinder and then pounded down with a hammer, and then it's almost like a symbiotic relationship. Like I hit steel on top of it until the steel's in the right shape that I want, so I can visualize the shape I'm looking for. So then the wood kind of has conformed over thousands of impacts to the shape I want it to be. So in terms of cutting tools, this, turn the camera around here. This one. This here is a knockoff of a Beverly shear, and it's a throatless shear, which allows me to cut curves easily. Let's get a piece of spare. This is actually one of the spare lanes for the project. I put this in the shear. You see that, and as I cut, because of the way this throat is designed, I can actually move the steel and actually put that curve into it while we're cutting it. And that, over a normal straight shear, is a huge advantage in armory. It'll save you a load of time cleaning up. Because what you find with people using straight shear is you go chop, 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 and then you spend next 15-20 minutes on the angle grinder or on the bench grinder, taking out all those corners you've just put into it. Right, and I think that covers nearly everything. I'll just show you some of the other stakes that and things I've got. So, or this one first. This is a tool I made actually just a few days ago, which is a tool for automatically making sure your rivets are cut to the same length. Now, cutting rivets, so if you're doing a coat of plates, you might need 100 or 200 rivets. And if you've got to chop them all, it's very easy to make yourself a load of extra work by having some that are slightly longer than others. Whereas this one here, just by adjusting this screw, You can see that changes that depth, and I can clamp this in the vise and just go like chomp, 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 chomp. There's nothing sacred about this tool. It's just a set of bolt cutters, and that's just a bit of 2mm thick steel that was scrap out of my scrap bin, and I've welded a nut to it, and I've welded a broken bit of drill bit to the top of that screw, and voila! And I've got something that's already saved me a couple of hours worth of work, several hours worth of work. Now, some of the things you kind of make are conical. So this is heavy, but it's a kind of useful stake that I picked up. Things like this, things like that, as well, with the pointy nose, can be useful for getting inside things that have been bent or bashed or dented as well, to help put them back into shape. I did once have to use my jack out of my car to put Duke Elfin's helm back into shape where it had been squashed. So having something to get inside is useful. This is another useful shape for putting flutes in, or angles or fans. And so basically you can put your piece on the top and hammer across, or put it that way and hammer that way, and you can get really very nice lines with it. And the advantage, it's not too sharp, so it doesn't cut the steel. If it was sharp, of course, quick going over with a file or an angle grinder or a sandpaper will take that off. Little like saddle stake like that. I just made 3 sets of spaulders for Dunimara, and this little curve on the top, perfect for the curve of the plates for the spaulders. What it meant, all it did was like clamped three of the 3 at a time in a mole with some in mole grips, and then just hammered them with a rawhide mallet over the top, like 5 or 6 hits, and I've shaped 3 pieces of steel.